Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's title, I'll be talking about Super Mega Team's The Night Witch, a Metroidvania that also incorporates shoot-'em-up elements with some deck building folded into the mix. Still, the question needs to be asked. Did this title deserve to be burned at the stake, or was I more than happy to have the hand this game dealt me? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. 14 years ago, the world was nearly consumed by the last war. It was only through the advent of the Night Witches, an elite squadron of freedom fighters, that the tides were able to be turned, in large part due to the Link, their ability to manifest the trust of their allies as literal power. Yet the final battle came at great cost. During the climactic encounter, the sky broke, turning the surface of the world into a blighted hellscape. Those that survived this pirate victory were forced to take refuge beneath the surface, eventually founding the subterranean city-state of Dungeonitis, a name only marginally better than Prisonville. Still, despite the difficulties, life went on, until the remnants of the old empire appeared, sabotaging a number of Dungeonitis' vital systems even as they besieged the city itself. With the old guard nowhere to be found, it's up to Rain, a failed Witch Knight recruit, to step up to the occasion and ensure her husband gets home safely. Here's the thing. Despite the cute graphics, the heartwarming interactions between Rain and her husband Akai, and even the fact that the Link could essentially be interpreted as, woo, friendship is magic, this story goes places. Essentially, it wasn't long until I realized this was going to be less of a feel-good story about a band of magical girls beating up bad guys, and more a thought experiment about what a mashup between magical girls, a PMC, and an idol group would look like. Let me explain. See, while the game's narrative largely plays out in scenes as you advance through the areas and clear out your objectives, you'll eventually reach a point where you're officially appointed as a Night Witch. An event that's important enough to warrant a press conference so people can recognize the person they'll be putting their trust into. Yeah, there's plot-necessitated propaganda to participate in, because the more you're trusted, the stronger you get, which is where the choices kick in, since while your handler will suggest that you lie, misdirect, omit, and otherwise try to control the narrative of the events affecting Dungeonitis and thus your public image, the choice is ultimately up to you. It's a neat idea, really, and made all the better by the fact that the various NPCs at the hub will react to whatever news you choose to pass on, as well as major events. Something which made the process of hunting down and rescuing the various villagers a lot more rewarding. That said, as much as they provided ample reason to sidetrack, I found myself just as often motivated to press on with the main plot. I was deeply invested in finding out just how the siege was going to develop, what twists and turns the story would take, and ultimately to find out more about the motives of both my allies and antagonists. And I honestly think that the Night Witch does a stellar job of it. That said, I will make one minor note on a narrative front, and it's the simple fact that while there are multiple endings, the choice of which one to get mostly hinges on whether you choose to fight the very final boss, or not. Thankfully, although the game tells you this choice occurs at a point of no return, once you've gotten the ending, you're sent back to a checkpoint, leaving you free to either see the other ending, or resume waltzing around doing other witch things. Speaking of which, so, like I said in the intro, this title is an odd collision of genres, since not only is it a Metroidvania and shoot-'em-up, there's a splash of deck-building elements in the mix too, which means talking about exploration is by far the simplest starting point. Admittedly, I do have some mixed feelings on this. On one hand, it's sort of nice that despite Rain being a rookie, she has a distinct advantage over most Metroidvania protagonists, being able to fly off the hop, which is useful both for combat, but also peeking over every corner of the room. That said, what she exchanges for it is, well, speed. Whilst you will eventually unlock a dash ability, it will be several hours into your playthrough. Until then, you'll be left gliding about to get to your destination. And honestly, this wouldn't be a major issue were it not for the fact that, like other Metroidvanias, you'll be rewarded if you backtrack to areas once you unlock certain items, or find yourself tasked with a quest to do. But here's the thing. The actual areas in Night Witch aren't small. Even with shortcuts, it can be a timely process to glide about an entire region, and you're going to be obliged to do just that since you don't actually have a fast travel system that'll take you between any checkpoint beacons you activate. Forgot a secret at the furthest end of a region? Neat! You get to teleport to its entrance and then hike your way over in case you missed what was actually important. Provided you actually remember what you missed, since you don't actually have map markers you can place for when a room is suspicious. I mean, you can eventually unlock a link with a particular lunatic that enables you to discern whether there's a secret in the room you've missed and how many items you still have to collect, but notably that's triggered by finding a heap of secrets in the first place. And I wouldn't be exaggerating when I say that I spent hours of my time backtracking around areas, looking through nooks and crannies for items, and still having to manually wander back and forth. Which is a shame since I did actually enjoy the exploring. There's some legitimately clever secrets scattered about the world, as well as some absolutely wicked bits of, well, I mean, it's not really platforming if you're flying, but look, laser maze! Yeah, little obstacle course nightmares like this were legitimately interesting to me and provided some great challenges to butt my head against. There's also a few instances of light puzzle solving to boot, more so once you get a certain late game power, though it's acquired pretty late in the race. That said, as much as I have a certain degree of enthusiasm for some of the mechanics they introduced in the game, I honestly hate the submarine so much. Not because of the water and navigation puzzles, honestly. That part was fine, as was the creative use of spells at my disposal in order to make paths. What made it rough was the combat, because you can't aim freely or dash as a submarine, effectively increasing the difficulty of that entire region by a rather considerable degree. And here's the thing, combat in the Night Witch isn't easy to start with. Yes, the early enemies aren't hyper aggressive, but the overall scaling of enemy health, the size of their swarms, and even their bullet patterns and speed escalate throughout the game. And even early on, it's entirely plausible to find yourself facing down literal walls of bullets, including homing shots, all while you're unable to dash. It's hard. And then this is further compounded by the simple fact that while Rain's effectively a mobile turret, her basic damage is nothing to write home about. Yes, she starts with the option to conveniently auto-aim, so you can focus on dodging, but that's at the cost of then nerfing her damage further while you're using that. Ultimately, the bulk of her offensive prowess is tied to the spell cards. So let's talk deck building. Essentially, the moment you acquire the cards, you're given the ability to make a custom deck whenever you reach a beacon, allowing you to pick special attacks and abilities from amongst the ones you started with, new ones you find in the wild, or acquire from boss fights. Which sounds neat in progress, except you have a whole slew of stipulations to work around. For one, your max hand size is 3 cards, and there's no natural way to discard a dead hand, which is a problem if you don't have enough mana to play a card. And before you say, well, get more, there's an issue with that. There's a couple, in fact. And one is that mana is generated by attacking enemies and spawns as a literal object in the world, which can then get pinned down under waves of bullets or bodies, especially if you're trying to move an enemy with a perpetually regenerating shield from the spot. What's more, if you're a tactical sort hoping to try remove cards from your hand in order to toggle up another card from your deck, prepare to be disappointed for quite some time, because even as you get a slightly larger deck overall, it's still entirely possible to pull the same card twice, even on a fresh pull, even if there's only one copy of it in the deck. A lot of my late game strategies thus became focused on being able to cycle my deck and fairly cheaply at that. In large part because while your hand size remains the same, your deck size will get fatter. See, when you find the Gaia Seed collectibles by exploring around, you're given an option for either a little bit more health or more mana. Now, you can't go all in on just mana or health, there's 3 upgrades for each, and mana really did sound nice, but it also obliges you to increase your deck size, which can definitely backfire if you don't have a lot of cards early on, forcing you to junk up your deck when you're not really in a position to be able to get through it. Thankfully, once you reach the game's hub, you do gain access to a character who can clone each non-boss card once, which, whilst not flawless as a solution, did contribute a great deal towards mitigating some of the randomness I was working against, or trying to establish combos. Not that doing so is easy, because spell cards which provide buffs will tie up a deck slot for the entirety of its duration, and if you're trying to combine two ongoing effects, like a sword-shooting bird and a rapid deck cycle, you'll find yourself with one card you can play. Thankfully, weapon cards at least have the good grace of activating and then giving you an ammo counter to mine and potentially reload, so that's at least one less worry. That's not to say I didn't like the spell cards conceptually, by the way. I think there's some interesting abilities in there, especially once you get the ability that lets you cast spells remotely. There's actually something incredibly satisfying about taking a spell that would normally be hard to manage, like the self-destructs, and then being able to use them more freely, providing covering fire for yourself and just overall wreaking havoc. But conceptually, interesting doesn't quite hold as much water as you'd think, given how frustratingly difficult the game's combat gets, such as the obligatory ambushes which lock you in rooms with oodles of enemies in fairly close quarters, and which later on incorporate some absolutely obnoxious obstacles at the same time. Even early on, it wasn't uncommon for me to be absolutely circled by projectiles, and the only breathing room I was able to get was the small grace period of cleared projectiles that occur after I took damage. These small bits of iframes also helped. That said, I think my biggest quibble with the difficulty, especially insofar as just how hard the ambush segments were, was I found the normal enemy encounters to be fairly well balanced and to make good use of the environment, and I often found that the boss fights were a lot more viable. Bosses at least have a certain degree of logic to them, even if they are fairly tough, but you were continuously made to fight these absolutely ridiculous ambushes in overwhelmingly cramped quarters, and a lot of them felt more balanced towards coming to them later on in the game, which just made for a painful time because you are locked in those areas the first time you encounter them. Seriously, it was moments like those that left me regretting my character build choices. I should specify, incidentally, that there are only really choices early on due to limited resources, since if you find everything, you can eventually max out your mana, health, gun powers, and spell powers, but early on, the choice matters a fair deal. Especially if you don't farm like me, and thus don't have money to throw at a certain EXP generating machine if you decided that telling the truth was your friend during a press conference. Seriously, there's nothing quite like having a 200% damage spell modifier and then just finding yourself blocked from casting. All in all, it's just a bit painful. Still, at least I could take consolation that regardless of my suffering, despite whatever brutality might be aimed my way, it was gonna look pretty. Because yeah, Night Witch is a good-looking game. I'd actually call it deceptively cute, since it does a good job of luring you in so you don't expect just how vicious the late game gets. I also have to give a fair amount of credit to the character design. A lot of them were really fun, and I thought it was really neat that when you do get an overall upgrade as Rain, she does actually get a different armor. I was also just overall a big fan of the character designs. A notable one that stuck out to my mind was when you are appointed a Night Witch, you get a nice shiny new outfit, though it was a little bit weird to have a sword on my back even before I picked up a sword. What's more, I also have to mention the music, which is a fair bit less deceptive really, since it provides some decent beats for your battles throughout the game, including some pretty fun boss tracks. But was all of this enough that I would recommend it to someone? Well, The Night Witch does have a strong story. It provides a unique concept in the form of the link that fuels the witches, and then decides that instead of making it a feel-good story, it leans more into a pragmatic look at how such a thing would probably be handled, with a side order of casual trauma, which left me wondering if I should be feeling indignant or bleakly amused more often than not, with the occasional dread realization. Gameplay-wise though, it's a lot more mixed. There came a certain point in the game where a lot of my experience with progressing became tinged with a constant feeling of annoyance, peaking whenever I found myself once more tossed into an ambush encounter. Factor that in with the lack of quick travel when I was once again diving into the far end of the map to get something I missed, and the tail end of the game frequently had elements that felt like busy work, something which ultimately tempered a lot of my enthusiasm for the experience. That's not to say that I think it's bad. I enjoyed those boss encounters like I said, and I don't think it's inaccessible. There are cheats you can unlock fairly easily from the menu, if you really need to. But the fact of the matter is, I felt that I would seriously need to consider how much of a fan of bullet hell, shoot-em-ups, and Metroidvania someone were, and how much someone would need to jive with the card system before I'd consider directing them to this game, despite how much I enjoyed the story. Which is ultimately why I rate this one a fumble, and I really do like it a great deal, but I did struggle with getting comfortable with the mechanics and really enjoying it as much as I might have otherwise. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, you can hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.